Hello everyone, I'm Drifting, and today I'm going to be covering a very unique web novel that I recently read called The Game Director That Returned from Hell. Um, I'll go over some unique points in introduction, and a couple things I want to talk about the channel. We're going to do this in a more podcast form, but I'm going to get right into it, then we're going to do introductions. So, what's unique about the game director that returned from hell? Quite a lot of things, actually. It's a grand winner of the 2023 World Munpia contest. So, this is a web novel that was originally is published on Munpia, but one of the publishers that were licensed is it's licensed through JHS. Now, I think I recently covered a web novel, a Korean web novel called uh, The Double Life of a Genius Editor. Right? Yeah. So actually, we'll get into that in a little bit. So I'm recording this during the holidays, but I expect this to be fully released in 2024. So that goes into my channel stuff and whatnot. As I said, I'm going to be doing this in more podcast form, so it's going to be much more free flow rather than just on the web novel, because I kind of want to cover an entire genre representative of that through this Korean web novel. But yeah, the great game director that returned from hell. It's the grand winner of the 2023 World Munpia contest. So Munpia, for those who aren't familiar with, is one of the big publishers of Korean webtoons, web novels. Very much like Soyetsu or Yen Press. Yen Press is like the bigger conglomerate. They own Bookwalker, all under Kadokawa. Kadokawa is the company that also owns Elden Ring as well. So it's a huge conglomerate that just owns all these subsidiaries, just like Tencent, Kakao, or Naver. These are all internet companies that own subsidiaries into web novels, such as Tapas, Kakao Pages, Naver, which owns a lot. Naver recently bought out Munpia, so Munpia used to be under C&J Entertainment. It was split shareholding by like Tencent, S2L, which was like a startup that did mergers and acquisitions. There's a lot of business stuff behind the scenes. But because of recently reading The Double Life of Genius Editor, I had a little bit more of a peek into the web novel landscape, plus my own research. And I learned that JHS is one of the huge publishing houses in Korea, alongside KW Books, Column Factory, C and D and M, Dom, whatever it was, I think the Japanese one, but there's like DNC Comics. These are the huge publishing houses that make webtoons possible. And there was also a manhwa announced for the game director that returned from hell. So that's enough about the business background of this web novel. Let's talk about the author a little bit. Pa Pa Pa. So Papa Pa is a very famous author. He does have a couple of accomplishments under his belt, as you can tell by his award. He's a licensed author, I'd assume, signed with JHS, Munpia, but he was also, from my readings of the Namu Wiki, he was from Novelpia, and his first novel was The Blind Saint and the Regressor, which is currently being translated by Genesis TLS. One of the site administrators is Virgin Slayer, as you can tell by his name, and even by the whole niche genre that Genesis TLS covers. They cover much more darker web novels. So if that's your style, dark novel community, whatnot. If you enjoy some of the more, I wouldn't say cringe, but like more mature to dark themes with an overpowered protagonist going through that type of very depressing worldview, then that community is definitely for you. It's not for me because I prefer more passionate urban life web novels. But if you enjoy that sort of isekai fantasy, um, where if you read Isaac, that's a previous web novel review I did, you'll kind of know the trend that heads to with Genesis TLS. The main heroines want to kill me. Obviously, we go into much more of the harem genre, much more of that romance, exploring a lot of the deeper, darker Korean drama sentiment, right, that you would see in Parasite or Squid Game. So it's a much more darker, mature theme. Um, my, I think there's a fantasy TV show friend of mine that would say it's almost very brutal. Um, the correct translation would be like a sort of visceral carnage or disgust, like ugliness, but there is an appeal to that, right? I'm much more like something like Subtle Disaster or Anasuma no Wara, but those are much more lighthearted to things like Yo Amari Sensei or Duty After School, which goes into much darker themes. I'm I'm a little bit I'm not that dark-hearted, but I do prefer lighter themes like Guardians of the Video Game. Anyway, the game director that returned from hell. I'm gonna go over the summary, and then I guess we'll get into the genre. And if I feel like it, maybe at the end we'll go into introductions and more of the channel stuff. So the game director that returned from hell. Here's a summary. Chon Yun-ho, a game director, dies from overwork and is sent to hell. Zatsukashi or whatever in Japanese. The only thought in his mind seeing the hellish scenes of hell was, it would be fun to make this world into a game. Surprisingly, he does get the chance to make his dreams a reality. He goes back in time to his college days in 2008. He'll pursue artistic and gameplay perfection to make games on Hell with the help of his colleagues and friends. The day I fell into Hell, I thought it would be fun to turn this world into a game. So a little bit more context. We start off, Chun Yun Ho is this scrappy indie developer who wins his first Game of the Year award in the year 2023. And he wins this Game of the Year award with his indie game Identity. And while he's traveling, he's working for this black company, NQ, which is probably like Square Enix or Neosoft or whatever. He dies from overwork, right? The classic reincarnation. Oh, he's going to achieve success, and then he goes back into his past life. And we start to see some very interesting characters. Um, we see he starts to build his team, right? And you'll notice it revolves around two characters: a sound designer, a genius sound designer, very much along the lines of Superstars of Tomorrow, Fang Zhao, right? Um, and a genius art creator, right? So that's his first team. Both college students. One is a freshman, and the other is a high schooler going to graduate into college. And so there's a lot of interesting character dynamics there. We have a lot of urban life, K drama, very light. The romance is very light, and that gets later on. You'll see that post chapter 100, where we see a lot of these things converge, right? We go through a lot of game development cycles where we see our main character Chun Yun Ho being this game director, and he is constantly innovating these type of games, right? And throughout the whole series, we see the history of game development unfold, the large landmarks post 2008. We see the history of Activision Blizzard, right? The huge conglomerates creating World of Warcraft, League of Legends. We see scrappy indie developers such as Minecraft come to the forefront. Now, obviously, these are very poignant, right? There's Legend of Zelda in 2017, Wind Waker, Breath Walker, The Lost Kingdom, Breath of the Wild, right? There's not, it's not like the Chinese style jam-packed game director development style, right? You see in Losing Money to Be Tycoon, that was very game development focused, almighty game designer. Indeed, there's something wrong with this online game planning. As I said before, all-time artist, full-time cartoonist. We see a lot of 2D development where it goes a lot more into the field of visual novels and just huge video games like Hoyoverse, Genshin Impact, visual novels like White Album, Steins Gate, but that goes much more into the animation and movie genre. There's a little bit of that, like you would see with Pokemon, but a lot of Chinese web novels and game directors, they have a gimmick, right? Very much like Losing Money to Be a Tycoon, where you have to lose money to gain that, right? Like, why can't I make games, right? The same author of I Only Make Bad Movies. Where the gimmick is that they want to lose money or lose popularity, and they create games like Super Mario Cat, like the parody of it, Flappy Bird, where they go into the history of game development a lot more. Angry Birds, because it's much more of a business fantasy tycoon wish fulfillment, where it's like, oh, you want to gain a business. This one is unique in the fact that it doesn't rely on older titles. There is some, but it's very unique both to the Korean genre as well as that whole lifestyle. So instead of creating something like fighting games like King of Fighters, this is, or like there is a little bit of that like with Candy Crush and Hunipop, but they don't focus too much on the bigger titles as it is with more competition. So our main character, as I said, he goes to hell and he starts to try, and his first instinct when he is in hell is to try and record all the events and then merge his memories into a game. So that's his fantasy as a game director. And we see a lot of these Korean web novel tropes come out. A strong protagonist leading a team, just like in Ark or Legendary Moonlight Sculptor, we see this driven CEO driving his team into the ground. So there's this culture of overwork because we have this idea of capitalism where it's like, oh, you have to work hard for success, right? And I feel like it glorifies too much of that, success is born through hard work and crunch. And I don't really like that message. But, for the sake of the story, I kind of get the direction of why it is. That's just how most urban life web novels go. You just have to squeeze your team. I don't really like that narrative, but, if you want to go into brutal hard truths, that is indicative of the Korean web novel genre. Now, we see a lot of that in Chinese web novels. We see a lot of that with Chasing Dreams. But with a lot of Chinese game director web novels, we see the accomplishment through achievements, right? It said, oh, these are the milestones. This is what success looks like, but there's this passion. Whereas for Korean web novels, it's like, oh, this is all about success and self fulfillment and self achievement. And to be honest, they're both the same type of thing, which is wish fulfillment. And to be honest, it's also both about culture as well. Chinese goes a lot much more into work culture, and same with Korean, and same with Japanese light novels. You would see that with Evil Ad Organization. But whereas Japanese focuses much more on life aspects, slice of life, much more casual tone. You see that with a lot of cooking, isekai fantasy. Korean and Chinese take a much more darker tone. I really like the characterization of these type of web novels: Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. Chinese much more passionate and hot-blooded because it's all about competition. So they want something a little bit more lighthearted. Japanese is pure, more leisure, but it gets more to the essence of it. And then Korean's much more about drama and these aspects of balance. So in terms of game development web novels, you would see stuff like that in Full Time Artist or um, I Draw Comics Quietly, where it's pure about the art, right? It's all about the work itself rather than the drama, right? Because that's the gimmick. Whereas in Korean web novel, it's much more about the drama of developing something, of creating something with your own hands. And we saw that with The Double Life of a Genius Editor, where it talks about the passion that these authors put in. Now, in terms of the business genre, this is much more like a man's man, where we see this crafting of this beautiful game and the struggles that they go through and the competition that they meet in this web novel. You see that with the novelist Who Left Through Time, where it's constantly about competition and about egos clashing against each other. You see that with Blue Lock, and you'll see that with the game director Who Returned from Hell. And as I said, this is written by a very famous author, Papa Pa, in a newer genre. But I'm not going to relax because of that, because it is a very unique web novel, just like the novelist Who Leapt Through Time, similar to the great storyteller. And it talks about a genre not often talked about, which is game development. Now, I've seen my fair share of game development web novels, from 2D animation, right, to movie studios, to these type of game wish fulfillment genre, right? I've read plenty of that. Titanfall, what the hell is this, right? That one's actually very unique because you have a boss with a losing money mechanic, kind of like Black Card, and you have, the game system mechanic, like Almighty Game Designer or bringing culture to another world. But the game planner Who Returns from Hell is much more about making that vision come to life and then kind of seeing that in through this landscape of game development. And it's so interesting to see, like with most Korean web novels, it's almost hyper realistic, where there's characters with very distinct niches and tropes and character personalities, and it's all about the drama. You have this genius creator who's always lost in their own world. And I don't know what it is, but Korean dramas do the workplace scenario very well, right? With Japanese, there's always like that hierarchy. In Chinese, it's much more about like office politics. Korean drama, there's a lot of politics. You'll see that with the Peninsula Prosecutor or whatnot. There's a lot of crime and like punishment, but this is much more subtle. It's more about human relationships. It's almost hyper human relationships, where it's like, oh, there's likes and dislikes almost to an extreme point, where we see, oh, there are various departments and you kind of see how things work. You have team one, which is very work oriented, just like in Legendary Moonlight Sculptor and Weed, where you just have this dedicated team constantly dying. You have team two, which is extreme in its own right, which you'll get to see their gimmick of how they resolve things. And then later on, I think around chapter 180, where they start to talk about um, remakes and whatnot, you'll see Team 3 has a completely different dynamic. And you see all these characters come to life with the background. You'll see on the cover here, right, Chun Yun Ho in the black hair um, is looking at Alice. You have the audio engineer in the background smiling, right? The younger character, the high schooler, and then his colleague, the art director. So that's the game director, the art director, and the sound director. Those are like the three main ones. And you'll get to see the CEO later on, Young Jil Sun. Um, and it's very interesting how they go to these types of subcultures, these niche genres, right? Otome games, and you can tell the author just has a love of games just for his respect, right? In one of my recent web novel readings, company goes bankrupt. I backhand cyberpunk. Chinese web novels admire the work, right? They admire things like Nintendo, right? Because Nintendo was a giant in the console war. You have Sony's beating off Microsoft's giant Game Pass thing with the PlayStation just blowing Xbox out of the water. And you just see that. This one's a little bit much more condensed and it's much more focused on the game aspect from Hell, right? And just all these cool universal scenarios, the five hells. And when I heard about that Hell scenario, I instantly thought of the biblical fanfic. I think it was Ovid. Um, Dante's The Divine Comedy, right? OSP, Red and Blue, they did a series on how um that was like a whole biblical fanfic. Yeah, Dante's Inferno was literally just a biblical fanfic of the Divine Comedy and whatnot. So that was really cool. Virgil, yeah, of course, Christ. So it was really cool to see all these just different scenarios. I really liked Hell number three. So you have number one, which was all about the prisoners. I'm trying to remember what the various genres are. I think two each of these hells had a different characteristic. Hell number four, which is the one I recently read up to chapter 202, was about love. Hell number five, oh, hell number one, was about Alice in Wonderland. What was number two? Three was about war. Four was about love, and then five was about the three kingdoms, which is just scholarly love. I think two is probably greed and lust, if I remember correctly. Um, I'm trying to remember the game mechanics. One was Flash, two was the first indie, and then three and beyond were all triple A's. Three is definitely Hell. Dark Soul like was roguelike Dark Soul Light. Um, that was the how they characterized it. Um, four was a detective game, so something like Grim Fandango. I'm just trying to think of what these games were symbolizing. What was two? I'm pretty sure it was greed, but I don't quite remember what. I keep thinking like Dark Souls or like but like yeah, it goes to the various eras, the death of Flash, which was in 2020, but just that era of Flash games. It discussed the development of mobile, which was huge post 2007, Flappy Bird being one of the indicative ones, but also Angry Birds as well, if anyone remembers those games. Plants vs Zombies, right? A lot of game development web novels will talk about those ones, right? Plants vs Zombies, Hearthstones, ACG, card games, Magic the Gathering, right? What are the card games called? I forget what that genre is called. Board games. And whereas a lot of tycoon business, fantasy, wish fulfillment web novels go much more the game route with Among Us, Werewolf, right? These social deduction games, and these just various trends. Card games, board games, D&D. This one is very unique of its modern take because it talks about, anything post 2019 to 2021 has to discuss COVID. I've only seen two web novels that I've read recently. One was a Chable web novel that discussed, pandemic related issues. This one focused much more on the work from home aspect and um, didn't go too much into the business aspect of that, but this is a pure game web novel. And what I like about it is that a lot of regressors, they focus on money. Oh, Bitcoin or whatnot. And, I'm just going to make a ton of money, stock market, wish fulfillment, pure thing. But some of these do-over web novels want to do more than just make money. They want to chase a passion. And I think at the end of the day, the fun of these type of do-over wish fulfillment web novels is that they want to change the world however they want. Some people are very basic in their needs and they just want to become rich, and that's a fun fantasy. But some of them really want to change an industry, right? Like the genius violinist, which is all about music, the god of cooking, which is all about cooking, right? Top management, which is all about entertainment, right? It's all about chasing fame. A lot of Chinese web novels, I think, focus on the chasing fame and success rather than wanting to change an industry, like creating games. things like Ming Wailing, Tomorrow Hasn't Arrived, which is, you want to change that coming future, or something like, The Game Director Returns from Hell, which is all about, creating good games. Some people just want to change the gaming landscape to be much more ethical, right? The gaming contract Double Life of a Genius Editor was discussing to change the web novel landscape. Now, the end result is you always have the conflict of business conflict versus, the goal that you're willing to achieve, and there has to be the compromise between passion and like what you want to achieve and what is realistic, which is, the business aspects. Like as you saw in Double Life of a Genius Editor, there's a compromise between, contracts and then developing a web novel platform and dominating the industry, right? Like, when you try to, when you become big enough, right? All young dragon slayers, if they become big enough, they become evil dragons in the end. And explored a little bit of this with the Chable, the background of the art director, Yo Serum. You'll see what I mean when you read it to chapter 150. You'll start to see a lot of the character backgrounds, the character relationships, and also that isekai do-over, not of the world, right? Like they're immersed in their past fantasy and how they get over that. That's always a unique aspect of do-over isekai main characters, where when they go to another world or when they regress, part of them is left behind. And Korean web novels do that really well, where they showcase both the humanity of the characters by discussing, oh, these are the people you've left behind, these are the memories you've forgotten, right? Um, my previous wife or whatever. In Chinese web novels, they kind of hand wave it, or they try to like, they use money to patch it up or something. But something like this in Korean web novels, they just do it slightly more differently, which I think is unique. Said before, this is a 2023 web novel. It's going to get a manhwa, and maybe in the future it may even get an animation. And it talks a lot about the history of CD Projekt Red and one of the big animations that revitalized that whole series, Cyber Edge Runners, and how that revitalized Cyberpunk 2077. Pokemon Go, right? It talks a lot about Game of the Year awards and the history of that, and very much like Double Life of a Genius Editor and many literary web novels, they talk about awards, right? Double Life of a Genius Editor, the Nebula, the Hugo Awards, um, the Goncourt, the Booker Prize. With game prizes, you have Game of the Year, you have the Dice Spike Game Awards, which is way, way back in the day. I only remember a couple Game of the Year awards. TGA, the Game Awards. Game of the Year, indie developers, Dice. There's a couple of other smaller games, and it's competition with huge indie games such as Minecraft and The Last of Us 2, um, the various flops and failures, and even successes. Tears of Famous, right? I think Legend of Zelda, Wind Walker, Breath of the Wild, right? 2017, and all those games, Super Mario. They don't talk so much about consoles. They only talk about Microsoft and Sony, but there are big ones like Nintendo's Wii, Wii U, the Switch, Nintendo being their own thing. Um, but they only talk about big events and focuses much more on game development. This feels so much like the quintessential like main Korean web novel tropes that you would see in Legendary Moonlight Sculptor or Overgeared, where you just have a main character pushing the sub characters to their fullest. You see that in real life player. And you could kind of see the characteristics of each country's cultures, right? In Korean, it's all about hard work and ethics, and it's like pushing yourself beyond what you can achieve. Whereas Chinese is much more about passion and competition and about like relationships. And then Japanese, it's much more about slice of life, enjoying yourself, but not losing yourself. And it always comes back to that quote. The Japanese are the Japanese are depressed, the Chinese are suppressed, and the Koreans are repressed. And it just shows the three different cultures of subgenres. Whereas Japanese are like the um, culture of overwork and salarymen, whereas Chinese it's like the culture of failure of like 1.2 billion people in competition, and then Korea's is just like the sheer density and smallness of the country compared to economies like China, Japan, and the US. And you see it through a lot of Korean web novels where they're constantly comparing themselves to the Japanese economy, which just seems to always loom larger than them, and the US economy because of the relationship. Whereas China is more like competing against the entire world. And the Japanese, they just don't, they're more just in their own bubble. They don't really focus too much on China or Korea, and they're much more inner self-reflective. Whereas Korea always wants to compete with Japan and China, which as it should, that's global competition. China wants to compete with the world. They look down on Japan and Korea. But they all, are competing with the U.S. because the U.S. is a big, and even in Japanese web novels, they don't even talk about the U.S. They always talk about U.S. support, but it's always more about, you know, self-supporting culture and like the promotion of good interests. And it's just so interesting to see the contrasts of the various styles of web novel through the three different web novel languages. And it's so cool to see that in the game director. I initially said I was going to go over channel stuff, but I think I covered enough with, the game director genre. This one's a little bit more ranty than I would like it, probably just because of the time I'm recording this. Um, but I don't think I have too much more to say for the game director Returns from Hell, but definitely a very unique web novel. I do highly recommend it. Moving forward, I do plan to do more Korean web novels because I'm dipping my toe into the genre, exploring what is the forefront of some of that. So hopefully I'll be able to do some Korean Academy web novels. I don't think I've done enough of that. Definitely been doing a lot of urban life fantasy, so I'll try to return to my niche and do some more wuxia titles. There are definitely some I want to line up, but just like as I said before, I did promise like the great storyteller, the Godfather of Champions, and we all saw how that turned out. So we'll see which web novels I decide to cover and which one I actually want to spend time on. Things like counterfeit heroes, space operas, sci-fi. Right at the beginning, I was doing a lot more sci-fi. Now I'm doing a lot more life and fantasy, which has always been my niche, right? Entertainment, passion, and web novels. But I do want to keep a variety. And so if I have the time, maybe I'll look back and see if there's any Japanese light novels that I feel like would be fun to cover. Something like Evil Hat Organization, Starting Over, just something. Like Generator Sun's not a here. I haven't read a lot of Japanese light novels. I may go into the familiar of Zero, actually. Um, but we'll see where that takes me. As I said before, I'll probably be releasing this in 2024 just because like I have a lot of videos lined up, but like also, video production does take a little bit of time, just, adding visuals and whatnot. So apologize for much more of the podcast style. But that's about it from me, from the game director that returned from hell. There is some translations out there. I think it's by Kari MTL, which sounds like it's an MTL translation, but at least it's getting out there. Again, it's licensed by one of the famous publishers, JHS, Munpia, and then the backend's Naver. You can see a lot more information on Papa Pi as well through NamuWiki. I'm getting used to the Korean search engines, Naver, Kakao, and as you can tell, I'm a little bit interested in the web novel industry as a whole. But that's about it for the game director that returned from hell. The author is Papa Pa. Some of his other works is The Blind Saint and The Regressor. And we'll stop here.